I know it's common practice to dedicate books. It's probably pretentious, or some might say silly, to dedicate a YouTube video, but I'm going to do it anyway. And this video is dedicated to Max and his brilliant channel, Max's Models, on YouTube. More about that later. Okay. Well, in 1960, 60 years ago, I was in first grade and I built my first model airplane. Actually, it was a guided missile, but that is another story for another time. I was hooked almost immediately. Well, actually immediately. And as fast as my allowance would enable it, I started buying real model airplanes. And like a lot of boys in that era, building model kits became an important part of my grade school and then middle school life. Maybe a couple years later, when I was in third or fourth grade, while I was in the local drugstore in our little town, I saw what I looked like a pretty cool model kit tucked away in the corner. And I pulled it out, and it wasn't a brand new box. It looked like it'd been there for a while. And it was a World War I fighter plane made by Aurora. And I thought the box art was pretty cool. And 69 cents I had in my pocket with a little bit more to spare, and I bought my first Warbird. I had built by then probably models that were a fair bit more complex with lots more parts, but I just thought there was something about World War I fighter plane that just intrigued me, and I loved this model. And over the next 2 or 3 years, I tried to find and buy every Aurora Warbird that eventually made its way to this small drugstore. I ended up with 6, as I recall. And continued to build models of all sorts. As I got a bit older, of course, I started building model cars, probably more than model planes. And I continued that up as a big part of my hobby in life until I got my own driver's license and started dealing with real cars. And the models eventually got put away, and sometime probably in the early 70s, while I was away at college, whatever was remaining on the shelves got consigned to the dustbin. Go on with life, and decades pass, and now I'm in retirement, and not so long ago I started thinking about models again, probably because I was watching YouTube and was fascinated by these various channels which featured building of just incredible model kits. But I came upon 6 or 7 months ago a channel, Max's Models, which was a celebration of model making, hosted by just a wonderful guy who presents the history of these model companies, as well as almost for a while a daily vlog of his activities in terms of building models, the ups and downs. And it made it all very real. And inspired by that, I decided it was time to get back into model making for static models after a hiatus of 3 decades, maybe closer to 4 decades. And I thought a good place to begin were those Aurora World War I aircraft in 1/48 scale. Simple kits. Usually the single-seaters had only about 30 pieces or so, and the twin-seaters or bigger planes didn't have too many more. Thanks to social media and the internet, I located a great source, oldmodelkits.com, which enabled me to rapidly acquire a bunch of boxes, 16 in all. And I made a goal to complete the collection before Christmas. So here it is, and I haven't shown all of the planes yet. And I'll try to begin with a little chat about each plane, sort of in the order in which I built it. I know which came first, and I know which came last, because the first one took quite a while, and the last one I just finished yesterday. So here we go. This was the first of the 16 that I built, and it was, or is, a FOcker D8. I chose this because it was a monoplane, and I figured getting one wing on rather than 2 or 3 might be easier. I think that turned out to be true. I also really liked the look. This plane was nicknamed the Flying Razor, and it was very sleek. It only saw service for a couple months near the end of the war. One of my friends in junior high school had this Aurora kit. I did not, and I always thought it was cool, even in the bright green plastic that it was molded. Almost needless to say, I suppose, back then we weren't doing much in the way of fancy decals or painting. We put these planes together in an afternoon or less, and maybe slapped a little paint onto the pilots or the wheels or some accessory part, and that was that. I wanted to do a bit more, and so I spent a fair amount of time acquiring aftermarket decals or decals from other kits from more modern and up-to-date versions or builds of the aircraft, because 60-year-old decals just don't do the trick most often. I also got aftermarket pilots, which I put in most of the planes. This plane actually has the original Aurora pilot. The molding was decent, so I left it. Okay, let's go over here to what was my favorite British fighter of the war, the SE-5A. I've got this one, and I did the livery in the squadron markings of the British ace, Mick Mannock. And this plane or kit went together pretty easily. Had a little problem of the fit with the engine, which wasn't molded correctly to fit in the right place, but a few chops with the Dremel and the Skell X-Acto knife fixed that. I did use an aftermarket pilot here. Maybe you can catch that the detailing of the face is a lot sharper than on the original Aurora. I think I got the color a bit wrong. I was still acquiring and experimenting with military colors. All of the underlying paint on these base coats and other coats, except for the weathering where I've done that, is acrylic paint. Most of it is either Vallejo or AK. Some scale 75 acrylics. So that's the SE5. Here's a famous plane and a contemporary of the SE5. Actually didn't get to the front until about a year later in the spring of 1918. This is Aurora's FOcker D7. It's again got an aftermarket resin pilot that I got out of an Eduard kit, as I did with the lozenge decals. This was my one attempt to put on the rib tape, and after doing that on one plane, I decided enough was enough. I figured the others would pass without it. Needless to say, the Aurora planes didn't have anything like that. As I recall, this plane was also came molded in dark green plastic, and I was able to get lozenge decals sheets so I could cover pretty much the entire plane with it. Here is the False D3, again with an aftermarket pilot. The paint scheme is lifted from a picture, a paint suggestion on an Eduard kit, which is sitting in the box. And I bought that kit not for the paint scheme, but for the beautiful decals. I really was taken with the black and white scheme. I forget which German pilot flew it. This kit went together very nicely. The False didn't get a lot of love, I understand, from I guess collectors or afterwards aviation historians or the pilots that flew it, but it had a long service life and performed credibly during the war. The SPAD 13, by contrast, well, I mean, the False is sort of famous. This very famous plane. Now, Aurora's kit came with decals for the AEF plane flown by the American pilot Frank Luke, the Arizona balloon buster. But again, I had Eduard decals and chose a paint scheme to replicate a French pilot in a French squadron. And this was the first of the bunch that I experimented with some weathering. Not something I'd done before, but I'd bought a few tubes of oil paint and tried my best to copy what I'd seen on some videos of streaking the wings and the fuselage to get somewhat of a weathered look on the plane. Again, an aftermarket pilot. Well, here's a famous plane, and you can readily see no weathering on this one. I've been tempted to weather the Red Baron's triplane. This thing was originally molded, or is molded, in sort of a really bright burgundy red or maroon red plastic. And that's how my original Aurora was built and stayed that way. I covered it with Vallejo flat red. And I'm toying around with the idea of eventually weathering it a bit. Richthofen only flew this plane for, well, actually, he took it into service in September, but he had some time off before the next spring. He got about 19 of his 80 victories in this plane, and of course met his end in this plane in April of 1918. I will say this, I think it's a lovely looking little kit, and it was, notwithstanding 3 wings, was the easiest to assemble in terms of the wing assembly. Those single spars help, and the construction was very sturdy. Something I can't say about all the kits. Makes me wonder how I ever got the wings on any of these planes when I was 8, 9, and 10 years old. I guess just lots and lots of model cement. This, of course, is a contemporary and an adversary, this plane, of the FOKER DR1 triplane, the famous Sopwith Camel. The livery for this is Captain Roy Brown's plane. Roy Brown was credited with bringing down the Red Baron, although more historical evidence points to the fact or theory that the Red Baron was down by ground fire. I did like the livery with the red nose and red tail. Generally, Allied planes were a little duller than the German planes. This kit went together very nicely, very clean. Most of these Aurora kits do not have rib detailing on the underside of the wings. They're just a handful that do. But at least in a display mode, you don't see that so much, and that's probably one of the big differences with the modern kits. Now, this is a plane that I really wanted when I was a kid. I saw it in the drugstore one day when I was 8 or 9 years old, the Newport 11. But I didn't have enough money in my pocket. My allowance was coming that Saturday, which would give me enough to buy the plane the next week. And when I went back, it was gone. Well, 60 years later, I acquired one. I got most of these models from oldmodelkits.com, which had a wonderful stock, and there's good history about each plane. It's a great site for finding vintage models, particularly aircraft, but there are also cars and military vehicles, etc. This is the smallest plane in the group. A fighter that was introduced in 1915, the first of the really successful Newport fighters. Now, if you look closely, you can see this from the angle here. Maybe not here, but yeah, there. The machine gun mounting that came with the Aurora kit is definitely too low. And this would not work in real life. That propeller would be shot off. Perhaps at some point I'll make an adjustment and raise that machine gun a little higher so that it'll be more scale accurate. I remember seeing this plane in the drugstore as well, and it was gone by the time I went back to get it many, many years ago. This is the Sopwith triplane, a very successful plane and the predecessor from the Sopwith Group company to the more famous Camel. It was highly maneuverable, so impressive that the Germans decided they needed a triplane of their own. And it was primarily flown by the Royal Naval Air Service. Again, the triplanes went together remarkably easy, and when I say that, there was nothing really complicated about these kits other than getting the wings on relatively straight and secure. But it worked best with these single spar triplanes, which both the Sopwith triplane and the DR1 have. Decals aftermarket pilot, of course. This is the Albatros D3. It might be a touch overscale. It was a big plane, and this model is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, single-seater. I had this one. It was in green as well, the molding, and that's the way it looked when I finished it almost 60 years ago. But I went around, hunting for great decals, lozenge, camouflage, aftermarket. That went on very nicely, I thought. However, getting the wood effect decals for the fuselage was extremely tricky. I don't know when they were made, but they might have been only half the life of the original decals in the Aurora kit, which made them very fragile. Anyway, I mostly succeeded. And that pilot is actually an Aurora pilot, not one of the aftermarket ones. Here is the first of the two-seaters I built, the Bristol F2B fighter. Big plane, and once our Royal Flying Corps pilots learned to fly it like a fighter rather than like a defensive observer plane, it could hold its own in combat with pretty much any German plane. It's big. It's a great kit. I was a bit worried about this one because I saw, and maybe you can see it there, that the lower wing or wings are suspended below the fuselage. I was really wondering how tricky it would be to get these wings on, especially with the double sets of spars on each side. But it all came together pretty easily. Again, I weathered this using oil paints to streak after on top of the acrylic. And turning to another two-seater, this was the first of two German two-seaters that I built, the Halberstadt C3. Again, lozenge aftermarket decals. Actually, all the decals here on the plane are aftermarket. It's got a pretty cool demon insides painted on, or decal to replicate painting of a demon emblazoned on the long side of the fuselage. Let me just see if we can pick it up. There we go. And again, all of that was aftermarket, as was the pilot and the observer. This was a successful ground attack and reconnaissance plane, 1917, 1918. I didn't know much about this plane, but I put it off near the end of the building process, but really enjoyed the build. This was the last of the Allied planes I built. This is the Newport 28, French-built plane, and but flown by the AEF flying squadrons. And in fact, they had this plane before they got the SPAD, because the SPAD was all the SPADs coming out of the factory in late 1917, early 1980 were going to the French Air Corps. The Americans had to wait. This has got the livery of Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading ace, who flew this plane initially for his first combat plane, and had his first 6 victories with this plane before. Near the end of the war, he got the SPAD 13 and scored another 20 victories. Very sleek plane, and I'm almost sorry I waited till the end before I built this, but it was fun to bring this process almost to conclusion with this final Allied plane. And then my last German plane, another bigger 2-seater, the Albatros C3, introduced earlier than the Halberstadt, 1915, and saw service from 1915 through 1917. Went together pretty easily. All the pieces fit well. The wing was not a problem, notwithstanding double spars for its long wingspan. And again, acrylic paint, oil weathering, aftermarket gunner. The pilot is tucked in there, but you really won't see him too much under the lower wing. See the tail of the dragon. And I had to wait quite a while for those wonderful decals, but they finally came, allowing me to finish this plane. Well, that's 14 Warbirds, and I mentioned that I bought 16, but the FOKER Eindecker monoplane isn't going to be built for the time being. It's way over scale, which is a bit of a mystery to me, why Aurora did that, because it wasn't one of their first in the group. Came out later during the series, maybe around 1960 or so, maybe a bit later. The other one is the Gotha bomber, which is huge. And not only would it not fit on this coffee table for display, it wouldn't fit on any of my shelves if I built it, so I think that'll stay in the box. Anyway, I had a really wonderful time building these 14 aircraft and learning a lot about modeling techniques that I certainly didn't have a clue about as a kid, and hopefully improving during the process. Very happy that there are places like Old Model Kits, as well as eBay, to find vintage aircraft, and mostly, and very happy to Max and Max's Models for inspiring me to get back into the hobby again. So there we go, and I'll try to zoom in on Mick Manick as I close this. Bye, folks.